The second episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds is entitled Children of the Comet, and I think it's a better episode than the pilot, actually, and probably a better example of what the show is supposed to be like in terms of theme and tone and just general standalone type stories. But the basic plot of an asteroid about to collide with a planet and wipe out all life, but it turns out there's more to the asteroid than meets the eye, is far from an original idea. In the original series episode, The Paradise Syndrome, the Enterprise has to prevent an asteroid from colliding with a planet called Amarant. It's the one where Kirk loses his memory at the colony that's descended from the Native American tribe. Anyway, this Strange New Worlds episode is pretty watchable, actually. It's just once again all a bit derivative and safe. This is an Uhura episode, and it begins with her being invited to the captain's quarters for dinner. As a new cadet, she's playfully hazed by some of her fellow crew members, and after the meal she tells the captain how she's not totally sure if Starfleet is what she wishes to do long term, which both himself and Spock believe is a great shame given her linguistic talents. Spock tells her that Starfleet has been the dream of many people, and that if she feels that it's not her path, then she should make way for someone else who wishes to walk it. Meantime, Pike once again talks about his deeply disturbing vision of his future, which he saw, of course, in an episode of Discovery. Number one tells him she refuses to believe that there isn't a way to save all of those young people he saw in the vision while avoiding being left horribly disfigured in a wheelchair. She finally brings up something that Pike really should have considered for himself, that his fate isn't written and therefore can be changed. Later, the crew attempt to push the Comet off course with some photon torpedoes, but suddenly a shield mysteriously activates out of nowhere. They discover a subterranean alien structure inside the comet. By the way, Sam Kirk, James T. Kirk's brother, is in this episode. The guy barely has a handful of lines of dialogue. And when they get to the comet later on, he's injured and left unconscious for most of the episode. He basically serves as a glorified redshirt. I have no idea why this guy is on the show. We learn nothing about him, and he makes zero impact because he's so woefully underwritten. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Kirk, La'an, Spock, and Uhura beam inside the comet because the shields aren't constant. So the shields only go up when there's a threat from the outside, so they can beam over to it. Now, much of the story centers around Uhura's discomfort and uncertainty at her place in Starfleet. It all seems a bit too familiar, to be honest. This exact character story has been done in both Deep Space Nine with Ezri Dax in the episode After Image, and the Enterprise episode Fight or Flight with Hoshi Sato, the unsure, untested crew member who has to rise to the occasion and overcome their insecurities and realize their place on the ship. This isn't a particularly original or even interesting character journey, actually. So anyway, the crew is in a race against time to save the primitive blue aliens on the planet from the comet collision. All the while, Kirk is injured, and a massive alien ship appears and attacks the Enterprise. This race calls themselves the Shepherds, and they believe this comet is a bringer of life called Mahanit. They must escort it on its journey. That's what they believe. This race appear to be like zealots, and they threaten the Enterprise several times, even getting into some pretty decent space battles with them. The Enterprise is no match for them. But I was glad to see that Pike didn't listen to La'an later in the episode when she recommended that they withdraw from the fight. Thankfully, she doesn't have too much to do in this episode because, like I said last time, I really don't like her character. What they find out by accident is that Uhura's singing seems to light up the cave inside the comet, and they theorize that the musical harmonics are a form of communication, much like mathematics. It's a rather clunky explanation, actually, because, as I say, this is all discovered by accident. Uhura's humming lights up the chamber, and then the big egg thing in the middle of the room reacts accordingly. But Spock makes a presumption here that only happens to be right. Now, if you found yourself in this situation, where you realized that the chamber was reacting to certain sounds, you probably wouldn't immediately assume that it was the singing that was doing it. You might just assume that it was all manner of noises. The first thing he remarks on is the cave seems to be reacting to your voice. That's what he says to her. And then she proceeds to sing more, and then they harmonize together, trying different notes until the cave lights up even more. But this probably isn't how someone would initially react to such a discovery. There would be some trial and error first, and it would have been nice to see that. I'm surprised they didn't shout or scream or make random noises to see if that did anything. They would have experimented, of course. But instead, Spock just immediately assumes the chamber is only reacting to music, to singing. It's not a big problem, it just didn't really help with my suspension of disbelief. It felt like we were being nudged in the correct direction. So after singing for a while, the egg in the middle of the chamber opens up, and for no real reason, the comet lowers the force field. Go figure. So they get to beam the crew back aboard. Pike and Spock hatch a plan to enable the Enterprise to get close to the comet so that Spock can take a shuttle with its heat shield activated and melt part of the comet. The Shepherds are unable to attack the Enterprise at this point at such a close proximity because it could risk destroying the comet itself. What's interesting is that the Shepherds' prediction may have been correct all along. The comet does in fact bring new life to the planet. A large quarry of water vapor enters the planet's atmosphere as that large chunk of comet breaks off because of what Spock does. And Spock suggests that this could permanently change the atmospheric composition of Persephone 3, making it more amenable to plant growth, agriculture, and one might surmise, societal development. Uhura explains a deeper mystery to number 1 Pike and Spock at the end of the episode. She decrypts a message that was sent from the comet, and inside it she finds coordinates for the comet. It turns out its flight path had intended to pass by Persephone 3. It had never intended to hit the planet. But Spock points out that if he hadn't have intervened, it would have destroyed the planet. But Uhura says, here's where things get weirder. She shows a zoomed-in image of the chunk of comet from the coordinate data and compares it to the piece that broke off after Spock flew his shuttlecraft. They're identical. But how could this be? The comet had sent this data hours before Spock flew his shuttle through it. There's no way the comet could have accurately guessed the shape of the chunk of comet before it broke off. The comet appears to have foreknowledge of the events. And as Uhura points out, the comet's mission to change Persephone 3 was predicated on Spock flying his mission. Chicken and the egg here. It knew he was going to do exactly what he did in exactly the way he did it. Pike is impressed with her work. It's a strange and head-scratching conclusion to the episode, but sometimes a mystery is a nice way to leave things on. Not everything has to make perfect sense or be perfectly explained. Pike and number 1 have a final chat about his own foreknowledge of his future, and they debate whether he should accept his fate or try to learn how he can change it. I really got the sense that Rebecca Romijn was really shining through here in this scene, adding some much-needed energy to the character. The Children of the Comet is not a bad episode at all, but the issue I have, as I mentioned in my previous video, is Strange New Worlds isn't adding anything new to the franchise like Enterprise, Voyager, DS9 or TNG did. It's basically just a quasi-remake of the original series, but with modern production values and brilliant special effects. At this late stage in the franchise's history, there should be a very good reason for a Star Trek show to be made, and it shouldn't be to simply reboot or retread old ground. Star Trek isn't moving forward, it's going backwards and repeating itself with some nice sets, great CGI, and better camera angles. After 2 episodes of Strange New Worlds, it's proving itself to be better than Picard and Discovery, which isn't really saying much, but I'm still not really in a position where I could confidently recommend that you watch this series, because quite honestly, there's fan films that have told better and more clever and interesting Star Trek stories than this. Every element of this kind of story I've seen in other science fiction and often in other episodes of Star Trek and done better. It's a rehash, and of course, I'm also waiting for a bunch of wokeness to descend in an upcoming episode. The final criticism I want to level at this show is the treatment of the character of Spock. Now, in the original series, Spock was the resident alien on the show. His hard Vulcan logic often created a bit of a distance between himself and the rest of the crew, though Dr. McCoy was an excellent foil for him, calling him out, arguing with him, even occasionally making fun of him. And Kirk, now and then, will get his own jibes in, playfully of course, but there was no doubt that they respected Spock immensely. His emotional detachment gave him a perspective and wisdom that the rest of the crew often lacked, and a brutal honesty at times. He was often frustrated by the emotions of the mostly human crew, and his emotional distance sometimes rubbed some people the wrong way, making him seem unsympathetic and cold at times. But McCoy and Kirk knew him better. They understood the half-human, half-Vulcan battle being waged inside of him, and they knew his emotions were just beneath the surface, which is why McCoy tried to get under his skin on more than one occasion. So while McCoy would oftentimes poke fun at Spock or scold him, the rest of the crew didn't. In fact, Spock had a shock factor about him at times. He was unpredictable. He was an X-factor and a huge presence on the ship. The crew had to learn to adapt to him, to adapt to how different he was, and over time, grow to genuinely care about him. Case in point, Star Trek The Motion Picture, where he first boards the Enterprise. Remember that scene? How delighted they are to see him enter the bridge. And then the palpable sense of confusion and slight disappointment when he just blankly stares back at them with apathy. Like I say, Spock was a big presence. The issue I have with this Strange New Worlds Spock is that he really doesn't have any presence. He's just another alien on the ship. He gets pushed around a bit and shown up by La'an in the first episode. In this episode, Uhura makes a snarky remark about Spock's pep talks. In the short trek where he's trapped in the turbo lift with number 1, she just condescends to him most of the time. The crew just really aren't all that moved by his presence. In the original series, Spock didn't really care about how he fit in with the rest of the crew. He didn't care what people thought about him. But this Spock seems to be sort of bewildered and confused by certain human behaviors and attitudes as he tries to adapt and figure them out. He doesn't even realize that Nurse Chapel is flirting with him. What I'm saying is, and I'm probably not explaining this very well, I think this Spock is being written more like Data from The Next Generation, the socially inept genius. People just find him awkward in the same way that Data was in the first couple of seasons of TNG, and maybe that's okay. After all, this is a younger Lieutenant Spock, and not the Commander Spock that we knew from the original series. But either way, we'll see how things progress. Overall, this second episode of Strange New Worlds isn't terrible, and I think it's actually better than the first episode. But once again, it's unoriginal, unimpressive, derivative, and it plays like a big-budget fan film, and on occasion, I even found myself a bit bored with the rather predictable plot. Twice, I had to stop myself from second screening. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.